The N64 wrestling games have a special place in my heart, specifically No Mercy, of course. However, there's one series of wrestling games that is always going to remain the most important to me. The SmackDown titles were PlayStation-exclusive wrestling games released in the early 2000s. From 1996 to maybe 2002, there was an undisputed king of wrestling games: the Aki Corporation. Their games were always miles ahead of the competition when it came to their controls and gameplay. If you've watched my last two videos, you know I've beat it to the ground at this point, but the important thing to remember is that these games were easy to pick up and get into without requiring things like extensive button combos or antiquated grappling systems. This is something the competition was sorely lacking at the time. It wasn't until the birth of the SmackDown series where Aki had some serious competition. In this video, I'm going to rank the 5 games with the SmackDown branding, from worst to best. Since I'm looking at less games than last time, I'll probably try to be a little more in-depth with each entry into this video. Also, I know that the SmackDown vs. Raw games are basically counted in the SmackDown series as a whole, but don't worry, that video will be coming later. For now, let's get into it. Something that always cracks me up is laughably bad commentary in a wrestling game. There's a few wrestling games with awkward or stilted commentary audio played throughout the matches, like WWF Warzone, for example.
My granny is the most feared object of pain in the WWF.
Wow.
WWF Just Bring It, the only game for PS2 with WWF branding, has the worst and also best commentary I've ever heard in a wrestling game.
Kane is the best World Wrestling Federation tag team champion we've ever had.
It might have laughably bad commentary, but this is still a really fun game. This list is a little bit different from the N64 games list because I don't dislike a single one of these games. Just Bring It really isn't bad, but I argue it maybe lacks an identity. Like, visually the game is alright for the time, but this really feels like the PS1 SmackDown games with a slight graphical upgrade. The game starts with this insane pre-rendered FMV that looks significantly better than the game's actual graphics, so it's a slight disappointment that the presentation overall leaves a bit to be desired. Match types are here and fun as ever, and the create modes are really good for the time. However, the Hell in a Cell match is definitely off scale-wise, which was a huge problem for wrestling games of this era for whatever reason. I think ultimately what lands this game in the bottom spot here is its similarity to the previous two and its incredibly short story modes. Something I will defend is that you're kind of meant to go through story mode multiple times as different wrestlers, but each wrestler's story mode you'll probably be able to beat in 10 to 30 minutes. This game also came out at a weird time for the company. They were on top of the world and putting on some of their best shows ever, sending off the Attitude Era with grace after buying out the competition. But it was still a transitional period between the Attitude and Ruthless Aggression era, and I think this hurts the game's presentation. For example, there's no SmackDown Fist Arena, even though SmackDown had switched over to that design a few months prior to this game's release. There's still a ton of fun to be had here and some crazy unlockables, and the fact that you can unlock Fred Durst from Limp Bizkit as a playable character is amazing. He's even got his own unique entrance and everything. This game, as well as the previous two SmackDown games, have this really weird turn of the millennium futuristic aesthetic to their menus, which I think is kinda cool looking actually, just a bit weird. It feels more like Tekken Tag Tournament than a WWF game, but it's pretty cool. Overall, I think Just Bring It is definitely still worth playing and plenty of fun, but every subsequent entry in this video is either infinitely more playable with more content or significantly more important in a historical sense, so this one just kinda sits in the middle as a bit of an awkward release. These games land the spot above Just Bring It by virtue of just being so damn cool for the time they came out. Ever since WCW vs. The World, the PS1 had been pretty shafted when it came to wrestling games. Yeah, they got the decent Warzone and Attitude, and the fun and silly In Your House and WrestleMania the arcade game. But other than Aki's first and only venture on the console, you were not going to find anything competing with the likes of WrestleMania 2000 or WCW NWO Revenge. At least, until WWF SmackDown came out. This game started my favorite series of wrestling games and is still really fun today. The sequel, SmackDown 2, is even better, providing more content and features. I'm looking at these two together because unlike the others on the list that have more defining features to separate them between games, these two are incredibly similar. I bet some of you couldn't even tell me which one we're looking at right now. That being said, they're both still great and introduced us to the early SmackDown titles really fast and arcadey gameplay. It's up to you whether you like how quick these early games are, and though later games would slow down the gameplay significantly, I personally prefer the SmackDown games that are somewhere in the middle. The absolute chaos of these games is kind of unmatched, however. You can win a ladder or table match in less than a minute if you know what you're doing. Speaking of ladders and tables, SmackDown 2 has a plethora of match types to choose from, outshining all but No Mercy when it comes to games from this era. SmackDown 1 is no slouch either, providing a decent selection. Both games are pretty solid when it comes to features, but I've never been a fan of either game's season mode, specifically SmackDown 2's. Even though it has its defenders and was probably pretty cool for the time, this season mode is a slog, and I don't recommend it. The first game's is a little better, but still not great. I'm glad that they're here, but they both feel kinda shallow compared to later games. Especially SmackDown 2's season mode with these little battle bars you have to sit through for every match, even the ones you don't participate in. Other than that, SmackDown 2 is a solid improvement over its predecessor and is the one I recommend booting back up of the two. You can nitpick these older games hard on some of their more janky aspects, but the bottom line is that they're still really great wrestling games that I think anyone can find some fun in. I feel like everyone knew what the number 1 slot would be before they even clicked on the video, but damn if it wasn't a hard choice between the last two. There's things about this game that I prefer over any other SmackDown title. There's so many crazy things to do in this game. I remember finding out about how you could climb the SmackDown fist as a kid, or even the big King of the Ring throne. And that animation that plays when you fall from a huge distance always cracks me up. Shut Your Mouth is fantastic. Everything here is fleshed out and fun. Tons of match types, great early Ruthless Aggression era roster, solid presentation and graphics, excellent create modes, it's all here. This game feels a little more like the earlier SmackDown titles than Here Comes the Pain does. It was the last game to have the older grappling system before Here Comes the Pain switched it to the 16 grapple system that would also be in the first two SmackDown vs. Raw titles. I really enjoy both styles, so it's good to have two amazing games to come back to when I'm in the mood for either. This game is noticeably slower than the previous 3 titles in the series, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. You'll notice that your moves feel so much more impactful, and wrestlers don't just no-sell your big moves and finishers. The animations are better than ever before in a wrestling game. Big aerial moves like swantons and frog splashes don't feel like almost wasted finishers like they do in previous games. They have their own custom animations for the person doing them and for the person selling it, and it works so much better. I really enjoy this game's presentation. The graphics are a noticeable improvement over Just Bring It, and models look detailed. This game has commentary in it as well, and I think it's really well done. It's very subtle, and they don't talk nearly as often as they do in Just Bring It, so it sounds a lot more natural. Also, this is personal preference, but I prefer having JR and Jerry Lawler on commentary, even though they were the Raw guys and not the SmackDown guys. I'm gonna say something controversial here, but I think that there's an argument to be made that this season mode could be even better than Here Comes the Pain. It's definitely a close call personally for me. This game's season mode is amazing. I really enjoy being able to walk around the arena before matches. They go super far with this too. You can even go to WWF New York if you get on the subway. It's ultimately pointless, but it's so cool that they put that in just for fun. You can also talk to random wrestlers you see along the halls, and this can lead to backstage matches or feuds. I also love how the story mode starts with the first Raw and SmackDown draft, which happened on TV around this time. Overall, Shut Your Mouth is incredible, and the next game on this list just barely beats it in my opinion. If you've somehow missed this one and you love these old wrestling games, you owe it to yourself to give it a shot. Just like my last list, I had to go with the obvious pick here. Here Comes the Pain is easily my favorite wrestling game ever made. I honestly don't even know where to begin. Well, for starters, everything I said about how Shut Your Mouth really improves on the animations and the overall impact of your moves can be doubly applied here. There's a weight to every character that wasn't fully incorporated into the earlier titles. Big moves like choke slams and power bombs feel gigantic here. When you play as a powerhouse wrestler like Undertaker, Kane, or Brock Lesnar, you really feel like your grapple moves are doing loads of damage. This is also in part due to the game's new attributes system, which is more fleshed out than ever. Playing as Brock Lesnar or Goldberg is honestly like easy mode in this game, and it's so fun. Touching on the roster, it's one of the best in any wrestling game ever. It's crazy to have a wrestling game that includes a lot of the most iconic Attitude Era guys, as well as the biggest Ruthless Aggression stars. This was the first SmackDown game to have OVW guys like John Cena and Batista, and the last for a bit to have legends like The Rock and Stone Cold on the main roster, though they were usually unlockable in later games. Part of what makes each character so unique in the game is the fact that their movesets have been so perfectly orchestrated. Guys like RVD and Booker T, who are very unique guys in the ring, have had their moves transferred over with grace. The animations are really better than they've ever been, and it all ties into the game's overall presentation. This game looks really good for being 20 years old now. In a lot of ways, I think it looks better than AEW Fight Forever even, because its overall look is a lot more confident, compared to that game's sort of middling approach between realistic and cartoony visuals. Match types are of course here in spades, adding a few new modes compared to Shut Your Mouth, including the Elimination Chamber, which is pulled off really convincingly. I always loved how you were able to climb the chambers for high spots. This game also added the first blood match, making it the first SmackDown title to have blood, and it adds a lot to the longer matches. Along with new match types, we have the best Create a Wrestler mode yet, with a huge amount of moves to customize thanks to the new grappling system, which allows each wrestler to have 16 different grapple moves. They also changed the reversal system so that R2 blocks grapples and L2 blocks strikes, and this is a huge improvement from using the square button to reverse in the previous games. Seriously, that's the hardest thing for me to adjust to when playing the SmackDown games before Here Comes the Pain. Anyway, the Create a Wrestler mode is great, and it's always been fun for me to create the most ridiculous characters using it and putting them into season mode. Speaking of season mode, I know I said that Shut Your Mouth and this game are incredibly close when it comes to their season modes, and even though I might prefer the former in this category just because that's where I've spent more time, you can't discount this game's fantastic season mode. I'm not going very in-depth in this video because my goal was just to give a quick rundown of each game, but I would love to make a dedicated video just on some of these games' season modes. I'll just say what most of you probably already know. Here Comes the Pain is amazing. I would personally argue that it's the greatest wrestling game of all time, and 20 years later, it's never been topped. I'd go as far to say that even if you're not a fan of pro wrestling, there's something here for everyone. Beyond just being a good wrestling game, it's a good game, and it's a shame that it was never bested. But still, any game that comes close has some pretty big shoes to fill. The SmackDown titles are always going to be special to me and bring me back to a time where the most important thing in the world was whether or not Jeff Hardy was going to be on SmackDown that week. I've tried to be as objective as I can in this video, but it's probably impossible for me to look at these games without rose-colored glasses. So if you prefer, say, No Mercy or Revenge to any of these games, or the SmackDown games aren't your cup of tea, that's totally understandable. But if you've gotten to this point in the video and somehow still haven't played these games, I highly recommend you do so. Even distancing myself from the obvious nostalgia bias, there's a lot of fun to be had here, and especially so with friends. Thanks for watching. Some of you may remember in the N64 Worst to Best video, I mentioned AEW Fight Forever, expressing my hope that the game would live up to the praises of some of these great wrestling games. Unfortunately, even though my expectations were relatively low, I still ended up pretty disappointed. I did a video about my thoughts on that game if anyone's interested. Links in the description.